The message arrived at 6:42 a.m., just as the sun was beginning to spill pale light across the kitchen floor. I had already been awake for an hour, sitting at the small table with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at nothing in particular. Old habits die hard. When you spend a lifetime waking early for someone else, your body doesn't forget, even when there's no longer anyone who needs you. My phone vibrated once. I smiled before I even looked at it. My son rarely texted me in the mornings. He was always busy, meetings, calls, deadlines, a life that moved too fast for someone like me to keep up with. So when I saw his name on the screen, something warm stirred in my chest. For a brief, foolish second, I thought maybe he was checking in. Maybe he had woken up missing home. Maybe he wanted to hear my voice. I wiped my hands on my sweater and picked up the phone. The smile didn't disappear right away. It stayed there, frozen, as my eyes began to move across the words. By the time I reached the end of the message, my face felt strange, like it no longer belonged to me. "Mom, please don't come to the wedding. She doesn't want you there." That was all. No greeting, no explanation, no apology. Just those two sentences, sitting quietly on the screen, as if they hadn't just split something open inside my chest. I read it again, and then again. Slowly, carefully, as if I had misunderstood the language. As if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder if I gave them enough time. They didn't. My thumb hovered over the screen. I waited for the rest of the message to load, convinced there had to be more. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he had meant to write something else. Maybe another text was coming, one that would explain everything, soften the blow, tell me this was temporary or misunderstood. Nothing came. The kettle on the stove began to whistle. Sharp and shrill, I stood up too quickly, knocking my chair back, and turned it off with more force than necessary. My hands were shaking. I noticed that before anything else, the trembling, the lack of control, it annoyed me. I had survived much worse than a text message. Hadn't I? I carried the kettle to the sink and poured the water out, watching the steam rise and disappear. For a moment I envied it, how easily it vanished. No weight, no memory. I sat back down and placed the phone face down on the table, as if not looking at it could somehow erase what it said. "Don't come to the wedding. She doesn't want you there." I tried to think logically. Weddings were stressful. New brides were emotional. Maybe she was overwhelmed. Maybe she was afraid of judgment, of expectations, of another woman standing too close to the man she loved. I told myself these things calmly, reasonably, like a person who had not just been quietly dismissed from her own child's life. But logic has a way of collapsing when it's built on pain. I thought about the first time I held him, how small he had been, how his fingers had wrapped around mine with surprising strength. I remembered the nurse smiling and saying, "He's got a good grip, he won't let go easily." I almost laughed at that memory, almost. I picked up the phone again, this time. I didn't turn it over, I just held it in my palm, feeling its weight, wondering how something so small could deliver so much damage. I typed his name. I deleted it. I typed "Mom" here. Deleted. I started writing, then stopped. Every sentence sounded wrong. Too needy, too angry, too weak. Too proud, I didn't want to beg. I didn't want to accuse. I didn't want to say something that would make him defensive, something that would push him further away. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the confusion and hurt, there was a quiet, terrifying thought I didn't want to face. What if this wasn't sudden? What if this wasn't stress? What if he had been pulling away for a long time, and I had simply refused to see it? I thought about the missed calls, the short replies, the way his visits home had become shorter, less frequent, more distracted, the way he had introduced his fiancée to me with polite distance, as if I were a relative he barely knew rather than the woman who had raised him alone. Raised him alone. That was the part that hurt the most, though I tried not to let myself linger there. I had never thrown that fact in his face, never reminded him of the nights I worked double shifts, the birthdays celebrated late, the exhaustion that settled into my bones and never quite left. I had done those things because I loved him, not because I wanted something in return. But love, I was learning, does not always protect you from being erased. The apartment was silent, too silent. No ticking clock, no television, no voices from the neighbors. Just me, the table, and the phone. I wondered if he had struggled before sending that message. If his hand had shaken the way mine was shaking now. If he had hesitated, reread it. Felt even a moment of guilt before pressing send. Or if it had been easy. That question scared me more than the message itself. I stood up and walked into the living room. On the wall hung a photo of him at 17, grinning awkwardly in a graduation gown that didn't quite fit right. I had cried that day, not because I was sad, but because I was proud, because I had done it, I had gotten him there. I stared at the photo now, searching his face for clues, for some sign of the man he would become. There was none. The future never leaves fingerprints. I sat on the couch and finally let myself feel it. The rejection didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like cold through a cracked window. First confusion, then disbelief. Then a dull ache that settled in my chest and refused to move. My eyes burned, but no tears fell. That came later. I thought about the wedding day. The music, the guests, the vows. I imagined him standing at the altar, smiling, confident, loved. I imagined the empty space where I should have been, where I had assumed I would always be. And then I imagined him noticing, or worse, never noticing at all. The phone vibrated again. My heart jumped so violently it hurt. I grabbed it, breath caught in my throat. But it wasn't him, just a notification. An advertisement, something stupid and meaningless. I laughed then, a short, broken sound that didn't feel like laughter at all. I could reply, I thought. I could ask why. I could tell him how much this hurt. I could remind him of everything we had been to each other. But I didn't, because part of me was afraid of the answer. Afraid that if I asked, I would hear the truth, one that couldn't be undone, one that would confirm what I was starting to suspect, that this wasn't just about a wedding. This was about being unwanted. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I stayed silent, and in that silence, something between a mother and a son quietly began to break. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Days passed without another message, another call, another accidental sign that I still existed somewhere in his world. I told myself it was temporary. People get busy, weddings don't plan themselves. But silence has a weight to it, and after a while, it begins to press down on your chest until breathing feels deliberate. On the fourth day, I finally dialed his number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I tried again that evening, same result. The third time, I stopped the call before it connected, my finger hovering uselessly over the screen. I felt foolish, like someone knocking on a door that had already been locked from the inside. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had with his fiancée, every smile, every pause, every moment that had felt slightly off. She had always been polite, careful, the kind of politeness that kept distance intact. She called me by my first name. Never Mom. She thanked me when I cooked, but never asked for recipes. She listened when I spoke, but her eyes wandered, as if she were already somewhere else. I had told myself that was just her personality. Now I wasn't so sure. At 3 in the morning, I got out of bed and opened the old box I kept in the hall closet, the one I rarely touched. Inside were letters, photos, small pieces of a life that no longer existed in the present tense. There was a birthday card from him, written in uneven handwriting when he was 8. Thank you for being my mom and my dad. I pressed it against my chest and felt something crack open. Was this the same boy who had decided I didn't belong at his wedding? Or had someone taught him how to say goodbye without actually saying the words? The next morning, my phone rang while I was making toast. I nearly dropped the plate, rushing to answer it. It was him. For a second, neither of us spoke. I could hear his breathing on the other end, shallow and uncertain, like he wasn't sure he should have called. "Hi, Mom," he said finally. Just hearing his voice did something dangerous to me. It softened everything. Years of instinct rose up automatically, the need to reassure, to protect, to make things easier for him. "Hi," I replied carefully, too carefully. Another pause. "I saw you didn't reply," he said. I didn't know what to say. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He cleared his throat. I didn't mean to hurt you. The words sounded rehearsed, practiced, like something he'd said out loud before, maybe to someone else. Then why did you? I asked quietly. Silence again, longer this time. She's under a lot of stress. He said eventually, this wedding means everything to her. She wants it to be perfect. Perfect. I thought about that word, how often it's used as a shield, how easily it excuses cruelty. And I don't fit into that, I asked. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. He sighed, frustration creeping into his voice. Mom, please don't make this harder than it already is. Harder, as if it wasn't already unbearable. I wanted to ask him when he had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle. I wanted to ask him when my presence became a problem that needed to be managed. But I didn't ask any of that. Instead, I said, is this what you want? Another pause. This one told me more than his answer ever could. I just need you to understand. He said, this is my life now. And there it was. Not a denial, not an apology. A line drawn in the sand. I understand, I replied, though my voice trembled despite my best effort. We hung up shortly after. No resolution. No comfort. Just an uneasy ending that felt less like closure and more like a door being quietly shut. I sat there for a long time afterward, phone in my lap, staring at the wall. Something about that conversation lingered. Not at me. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Like someone repeating a script they didn't fully believe in. Later that day, I ran into his aunt at the grocery store. She smiled when she saw me, then hesitated, as if remembering something too late. You must be busy with wedding preparations, she said. I forced a smile. I'm not involved. Her expression shifted, confusion, then something closer to concern. Oh, she said slowly, I thought you chose not to come. The air seemed to thin around us. Why would you think that? I asked. She looked uncomfortable now. Well, that's what he told everyone. That you didn't approve, that you didn't want to be part of it. The words hit me harder than the text message ever had. I drove home in a fog, barely aware of the traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel, so tightly my fingers ached. He had told them I didn't want to come, which meant this wasn't just exclusion. It was erasure. By the time I reached my apartment, the hurt had shifted into something sharper, something colder. Questions began stacking up, one on top of another, each more unsettling than the last. Who had suggested that lie? Who had benefited from it? And how long had this story been forming without me knowing? That night, I sat at the table again, the same place where I had read the message days earlier. I turned my phone over and unlocked it, scrolling through old photos, old messages, old proof that I had once mattered. One thought refused to leave me alone. Someone had rewritten me out of his life, and they hadn't done it alone. I didn't sleep at all that night. The lie his aunt had repeated echoed in my head, over and over, until it stopped sounding shocking and started sounding deliberate. People don't invent stories like that by accident. They repeat what they've been told, and someone had made sure that version of events traveled faster than the truth ever could. By morning, something inside me had shifted. The hurt was still there, heavy and raw, but beneath it was a quieter, steadier resolve. I needed to understand how this had happened. Not to argue, not to beg my way back in, just to know when I had stopped being seen. I started with the guest list. I didn't have it, of course, but I had something almost as useful: people, family members who loved to talk, who filled silences with details they didn't realize were dangerous. I made a few calls under the excuse of casual curiosity. Nothing obvious, nothing that would raise suspicion. Each conversation gave me a fragment. One cousin mentioned how considerate I was for stepping aside so the bride could have her moment. Another said he admired how mature I'd been about, not agreeing with the marriage, but staying quiet. Someone else told me it was brave of me to put my pride aside. Every version painted me as the problem. By noon, my hands were trembling again. But this time, it wasn't weakness. It was anger, controlled, restrained, but alive. Someone had carefully shaped a narrative where my absence wasn't cruel, it was necessary, justified, even noble. I wondered if my son knew how far the story had spread, or if he had helped spread it. In the afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I drove to their apartment. I told myself I wouldn't go inside, that I just wanted to see the place, understand the life he was building. But when I reached the building and saw his car in the parking lot, something pulled me forward before I could talk myself out of it. The lobby smelled like fresh paint and expensive cleaning products. A doorman nodded politely as I passed. Everything about the place felt curated, controlled. I knocked. There was movement inside, footsteps, then the door opened. She stood there. Up close, she was even more composed than I remembered. Hair perfectly styled, expression neutral, almost pleasant. She looked surprised to see me, but only for a second. Then it was gone. "Oh," she said softly, "I didn't know you were coming." "I didn't either," I replied. She stepped aside without inviting me in, but there was no resistance either. I crossed the threshold, feeling like I had entered a space where I didn't belong. My son wasn't in the room. I could hear him somewhere down the hall. On a call, his voice low and tense. She gestured toward the couch. "Would you like to sit?" "No," I said, "I won't stay long." That seemed to please her. "We should talk," I continued, "about the wedding." Her smile tightened. I assumed everything was already clear. "Clear to whom?" I asked. She folded her arms, still calm, to us. There it was, us. A boundary drawn with a single word. "I've been told I didn't want to attend." I said that I don't approve of your marriage. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, but I saw it. "That's not what we meant," she said smoothly. "But it's what people believe." She sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Sometimes it's easier to simplify things." "Simplify," I repeated, "or control." Her jaw tightened now. The politeness began to crack. "You have to understand," she said, lowering her voice. "This is a new chapter. We're trying to start fresh." "Fresh," I said, "without me." She didn't deny it. My son appeared then, standing at the end of the hallway. He looked caught off guard, like a child who hadn't expected his parents to come home early. His eyes moved between us, uneasy. "Mom," he said, "you didn't tell me you were coming." "I didn't know I was either," I replied. He looked at her. She met his gaze calmly, reassuringly, a look that said, "I've got this." Something about that exchange made my stomach turn. "I just want the truth," I said to him. "Did you tell people I chose not to come?" He hesitated. That hesitation was everything. "It was easier that way," he said finally. "Easier." Not kinder, not honest. "Easier." I felt something give way inside me then, not a dramatic break, but a quiet surrender. The realization that I was standing in a room where the story had already been written, and I was never meant to be a character with a voice. "I didn't raise you to lie," I said softly. He looked away. She stepped forward. "No one is lying. We're protecting our peace." Peace. A word that sounded disturbingly close to exclusion. "I won't interfere," I said. "I never planned to. But I won't be erased either." Her expression hardened. "Sometimes distance is necessary." "For whom?" I asked. "For us," she replied without hesitation. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about a wedding. It was about power. And she had been shaping his world carefully, patiently, long before I ever read that message. I left without another word. The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt far louder than it should have. In the elevator, my reflection stared back at me, older. Yes, but clearer. I finally saw what I had refused to see before. Love wasn't the only thing guiding my son anymore. Fear was, and someone else was holding the strings. I didn't cry after I left their apartment. That surprised me. I expected tears, shaking hands, the familiar collapse that usually followed moments like this. But instead, there was a strange stillness inside me, as if my body had decided that panic would be useless now. Something else was required. Clarity. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the city lights flickering faintly through the window. I replayed every conversation, every look, every carefully chosen word she had used. None of it was accidental. People like her didn't improvise. They planned, they adjusted, they watched, and they waited. I began to notice things I had ignored before, small details that now felt deliberate. How she always positioned herself between my son and anyone else during family gatherings. How she answered questions meant for him. How she laughed softly whenever he disagreed with her, never arguing, just smiling, making his resistance seem childish. Control doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like affection. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't my son. It was her mother. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering, already sensing that this call wasn't about reconciliation. "Hello," I said. She spoke politely, warmly even, but there was an edge beneath it, a practiced confidence that came from knowing she had the upper hand. "I just wanted to clear the air," she said. "There's been so much misunderstanding." "Has there?" I replied. She ignored the tone. "My daughter has been under immense pressure. Weddings bring out emotions. You know how it is." "I do," I said. "I also know how lies work." There was a brief pause. "No one is lying," she said carefully. "But sometimes, certain influences make it hard for young couples to move forward." Influences. The word landed exactly where it was meant to. "You mean me," I said. "I mean the past," she replied smoothly. "The way children are raised can create attachments that make independence difficult." My grip tightened around the phone. "He lost his father at 5, I said. "If you're implying—" "I'm implying," she interrupted gently, "that he deserves a fresh start, free of guilt." That word again. Guilt. The same one his fiancée had used. The same one that explained everything. They weren't just pushing me out. They were reframing me as a burden. "I never asked him to choose," I said. "But he feels he has to," she replied. "That's the problem." The call ended shortly after. No threats. No raised voices. Just a quiet confirmation of what I had begun to suspect. This wasn't impulsive. It was inherited. That afternoon, I met an old friend for coffee. Someone who had known my son since childhood. Someone who wasn't connected to the wedding, to the gossip, to the new version of events. She listened without interrupting as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "This isn't the first time," she said finally. My stomach dropped. "The first time." She hesitated. I wasn't sure it was my place to say anything, but now. She told me about his previous relationship, the one that ended abruptly 2 years ago. How the woman had slowly isolated him from friends. How arguments always ended with him apologizing, even when he hadn't done anything wrong. How he had begun canceling plans, changing opinions, doubting himself. She made him feel like loyalty was something he owed. My friend said, like love came with conditions. The pattern was unmistakable. Different woman, same result. I drove home with my hands numb on the steering wheel. It wasn't just about me. It had never been. This was bigger, deeper, and far more dangerous than exclusion from a wedding. He was being reshaped. And the most terrifying part was that he didn't realize it. That night, I went through my old messages with him. I read them slowly, noticing how the language had changed over time. Where there had once been certainty, there was now hesitation. Where there had been confidence, there was now constant justification. I saw it clearly now. He wasn't choosing distance. He was being taught to fear closeness. Another message arrived late that evening. From him. "Please don't talk to people about this. It's making things harder." Harder for whom? I stared at the words until my eyes burned. This wasn't a request. It was a warning. And for the first time, a new fear took root in me, quiet, cold, and sharp. If I stayed silent, I would disappear. But if I spoke up, I might lose him forever. I read his message again and again until the words stopped feeling like sentences and started feeling like a boundary I wasn't allowed to cross. "Please don't talk to people about this. It's making things harder." I wondered when my voice had become a threat. I didn't reply. That night, I dreamed I was standing outside a locked house, knocking until my hands bled. No one answered. When I finally looked through the window, I saw him sitting at a table, smiling while someone gently turned his chair so he couldn't see me. I woke up gasping. Fear has a way of clarifying things. By morning, I knew silence was no longer neutral. It wasn't protecting him. It was protecting the story they wanted to tell. And every hour I stayed quiet, that story hardened into truth. I started documenting everything: dates, messages, conversations, the exact words people repeated back to me. I didn't know what I would need it for. Only that instinct told me I would need it. Mothers develop instincts not because they are mystical, but because they are forced to pay attention. Around noon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was him. His voice was different this time, tighter, controlled. "Why did you go to the apartment?" he asked. "I wanted to talk," I said. "That's still allowed, isn't it?" "You caught us off guard," he replied. She was very upset. Upset. That word had begun to mean something else entirely. "She's saying you're trying to sabotage the wedding." He continued, "that you're turning people against her." I closed my eyes. I didn't say a word about her. I said, "I only corrected a lie about myself." "She doesn't see it that way." "Do you?" Another pause. "I just want this to be over," he said. That was the moment I understood the depth of it. He wasn't defending her. He was exhausted. "Are you happy?" I asked quietly. "Yes," he said too quickly. I almost believed him. Almost. That afternoon, I received an email from someone I hadn't heard from in years. His former coworker. The subject line was vague: "Hope you're okay." Inside, the message was short but unsettling. "I heard what's happening. If you ever need confirmation that this isn't in your head, I can talk." My heart pounded. Confirmation. This wasn't just my fear anymore. We spoke later that evening. He was careful, hesitant, like someone who had learned the cost of saying too much. He told me about arguments my son had confided in him about. How he was constantly afraid of disappointing her. How every disagreement ended with silence that lasted for days until he apologized. He said if he lost her, he'd have nothing. The man said, "That scared me." It scared me too. That night, my son came to my door. I hadn't heard the elevator. I hadn't heard his footsteps. I only heard the knock, soft, hesitant, unsure. When I opened the door, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but emotionally. Like someone who had been carrying a weight far too heavy for too long. "I need you to stop," he said. "Stop what?" "Talking, asking questions. It's putting me in an impossible position." I studied his face, the tension in his jaw, the dark circles under his eyes. This wasn't love glowing on him. It was fear eating him alive. "Who told you to say that?" I asked. His eyes flicked away. That answer was enough. "If I stop," I said, "what happens next?" He didn't respond. "You'll stop seeing me altogether." I pressed, "You'll stop calling." "I don't know," he whispered. That broke something in me. "I won't fight you," I said. "I won't interfere with your wedding. But I won't accept being painted as a villain either." He looked at me then, really looked at me. And for a moment the mask slipped. "She says you're trying to control me." He said that you don't want me to grow up. I felt the sting, but I didn't flinch. "I raised you to think," I said, "not to disappear." He stayed only a few minutes longer. When he left, he didn't hug me. The door closed softly behind him. Too softly. Later that night, I received a message from an unknown account. No name, no photo. "If you keep pushing, you will lose him. This is your only warning." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, cold spreading through my chest. This wasn't just emotional anymore. It was a threat. And for the first time, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. This situation wasn't going to resolve itself quietly. Someone was willing to make sure I stayed silent, no matter the cost. I didn't delete the message. I didn't reply either. I sat there in the dark, phone glowing faintly in my hand, reading the words until they burned themselves into my memory. "This is your only warning." Warnings are meant to scare people into obedience. And for a brief moment, it worked. I imagined losing him completely, his number blocked, his door closed, his life moving forward as if I had never existed. The thought hollowed me out. But fear doesn't only weaken you. Sometimes it sharpens you. By morning, I knew two things with absolute certainty. Someone was monitoring the situation closely, and they were afraid, not of me, but of what I might uncover. I began quietly, carefully. I stopped calling family members. I stopped correcting lies in public. Outwardly, I did exactly what they wanted. Silence, distance, compliance. Internally, I moved faster than I ever had. I contacted a counselor I had once spoken to years ago, during a difficult period after my husband's death. I didn't mention names at first. I described behaviors, patterns, isolation, emotional pressure disguised as concern. She didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, she said, "What you're describing isn't conflict, it's coercive control." The words settled heavily between us. This kind of manipulation works best when the victim believes they're choosing it. She continued, "And when anyone who threatens the narrative is removed." Removed how? I asked. Emotionally at first, she said. Socially, sometimes financially. The goal is dependency. Dependency. My son had once been fiercely independent. Now he asked permission to breathe. I left that appointment shaking, not with doubt, but with grim recognition. This had a name, and things with names could be confronted. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. He called me. His voice was low, urgent. "Are you alone?" "Yes." They went through my phone, he said. My heart dropped. Who? She and her mother. They said they were worried about outside influence. Outside influence. Me. They found old messages, he continued. From you, from friends. They said it proves you're trying to turn me against them. "Are you?" I asked gently. "No," he said, "but they don't believe me." I could hear it then, the tremor beneath his words, the fear he'd been taught not to name. "They told me if I don't set firmer boundaries." "The wedding is off," he whispered. There it was. The weapon. "And what do you want?" I asked. Silence, breathing, then quietly, "I don't know anymore." That answer terrified me more than any threat. "Listen to me," I said, choosing every word with care. "You are allowed to have people in your life who love you. You are allowed to question. You are allowed to think." "She says that's manipulation," he replied. "Of course she did." "Did she ask you to call me?" I asked. "No," he said quickly. I went into the bathroom and locked the door. Something inside me went cold. "How long do you have?" I asked. "Not long." I spoke fast then, not emotionally, but clearly. I told him what coercive control was. I told him what patterns looked like. I didn't accuse, I didn't insult, I gave him facts. When I finished, he was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly, like someone who didn't feel safe falling apart. "I feel like I'm disappearing," he said. That was the moment. The exact moment when fear shifted sides. "You're not," I said, "but you are being pushed to." The call ended abruptly. I stared at the phone, knowing it might be the last honest conversation we'd have for a long time. 2 hours later, another message arrived from the unknown account. "You crossed a line. This ends now." I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded every message, every screenshot, every detail I had documented to an email address I had created that morning. A digital trail, proof. Because the truth about people who rely on silence is simple. Once they realize silence is gone, they escalate. And I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever came next would not be subtle. The escalation came sooner than I expected. By the next morning, my son's phone was unreachable. Straight to voicemail, no read receipts, no online status. It was as if he had been erased overnight. I didn't panic. Panic is what manipulators rely on. Instead, I did something that felt almost unnatural to me. I waited. Around noon, the call came, not from him but from her. Her voice was calm, confident, stripped of the softness she used in public. This wasn't the woman who smiled politely at family dinners. "This needs to stop," she said. "I agree," I replied. She didn't like that answer. I could hear it in the slight tightening of her breath. "You've been interfering," she continued, filling his head with ideas, turning him against the people who actually care about him. "You mean you," I said. "I mean us," she snapped. "We are his future, you are his past." The words were meant to wound. They didn't. "What are you afraid of?" I asked. She laughed softly. "I'm not afraid of anything. But fear has a sound, and I heard it." "You went through his phone," I said. "You threatened him with canceling the wedding. You told him love was conditional." That's not what happened. It is, I replied, and I have proof. Silence, not the thoughtful kind, the calculating kind. You think anyone will believe you. She said, you're emotional, you're alone. You've already been framed as unstable. Unstable, the final label. Tell me something, I said quietly. Did you use the same words on the woman before me? Her breath caught, just for a second, but it was enough. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. You isolate, I continued. You rewrite reality. You punish disagreement with withdrawal. And when someone notices, you make them the villain. Stop, she said sharply. You didn't expect me to recognize the pattern. I said, you thought grief made me weak. The line went dead. Within an hour, the fallout began. I received messages from relatives, confused, alarmed, suddenly uncertain. The story they'd been told was unraveling. Screenshots were circulating. Contradictions were being noticed. Someone had asked why my son looked exhausted in every recent photo. Someone else had remembered his previous relationship ending the same way. Truth has momentum. Once it starts moving, it's hard to stop. That evening, there was a knock at my door. Not soft this time. Urgent. When I opened it, my son was standing there with a small bag in his hand. His face was pale, eyes red, jaw set in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager standing up to a school bully. They told me you're dangerous, he said. I stepped aside. Come in. They said you're trying to destroy my life. I closed the door behind him, and what do you think? He sat down heavily, head in his hands. I think I haven't slept in weeks. He said, I think I don't recognize myself anymore. And I think every time I questioned anything, I was punished. He looked up at me then, eyes filled with something raw and unfiltered. They admitted they read my messages. He continued, they said privacy is a privilege, not a right. My chest tightened. That's when it clicked, he said. That's when I realized love wasn't supposed to feel like surveillance. He stayed with me that night. For the first time in months, he slept deeply. But peace never comes without consequences. By morning, his phone was flooded. Calls, messages, voicemails shifting rapidly from apology to accusation to rage. Promises turned into threats. Love turned into control again, now fully exposed. And then came the final message. If you don't come back today, we will tell everyone the truth about your mother. He handed me the phone, hands shaking. There is no truth, he said, just lies. I looked at him and saw the boy I had raised. Hurt, yes, but awake. They're desperate, I said, and desperate people reveal themselves. He nodded slowly. I don't want the wedding, he said. I want my life back. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that something irreversible had just happened inside a quiet apartment. A decision had been made. But endings like this don't end quietly. They retaliate. And I knew the next move wouldn't come from fear. It would come from revenge. By morning, the air in the apartment felt heavy, almost electric. I could feel it before I even touched my phone. Every notification, every vibration seemed to hum with intent. They were moving, they weren't subtle anymore. They had realized their narrative was cracking. And desperation makes people reckless. My son sat at the kitchen table, staring at the floor. The bag from the night before still lay on the couch. Untouched, I knew what he was thinking. That no matter how much he wanted freedom, the consequences of stepping away would come crashing down. Then the first message appeared. You exposed us, now it's personal. The sender wasn't her, not directly. It was a burner account, one that could vanish in an instant. But the tone, the timing, the precision, it all pointed back to her. And I realized, sharply, that what had been emotional coercion was now turning into intimidation. I didn't reply. Instead, I organized. Every message, every call, every witness account went into a secure folder. I wasn't going to react blindly. Retaliation for me wasn't about anger. It was about preparation. The next call came within an hour. My son answered first. I overheard the words from the other room. Leave it alone or it gets worse. The voice said, calm, cold, a threat hidden behind politeness. My son's voice shook. I can't, I won't. Click, the line went dead. I walked into the living room. He looked at me pale, almost defeated. They're trying to scare me back into obedience. He said, they're relentless. I took his hand. Then we make sure their lies can't survive scrutiny. Over the next few days, the assault escalated. Emails that looked casual but carried threats. Messages implying exposure, humiliation, social isolation. Even mutual friends began questioning things, asking awkward questions, uncertain whose side to take. But we didn't falter. Every attack made our resolve sharper. Every attempt to frighten him only confirmed how fragile their control really was. Then came the first visible crack. One of her mother's friends, someone influential in their circle, accidentally revealed a small detail, proof that corroborated my son's experience. It wasn't enough to dismantle the whole web, but it was enough to show that the narrative they had built was being questioned. That night, my son sat across from me, exhausted but alive. They're going to escalate. He whispered, they don't play fair. They already crossed that line. I said, but now they've shown who they really are. And then it happened. A message from her, direct this time. You think you've won, you've just made it personal. We will destroy the image of your family if you continue. I didn't flinch. I showed it to my son. His face tightened, but he didn't look away. We're not the villains here, I said. They are. The revelation hit him then, the full pattern. The control, the manipulation. The lies designed to isolate him and frame me as the problem. Everything that had seemed confusing, cruel, or random now had a name. Deliberate, orchestrated coercion. By the end of the week, a strange calm settled over us. Not peace, not victory, but clarity. We understood exactly what we were facing. And knowing your opponent's moves before they make them is the first step toward turning the game. The next step, I knew, would not be defensive. It would be offensive. And I felt a strange surge of strength, part fear, part resolve, part adrenaline. That made it impossible to doubt we could survive what was coming. Because once you see the machinery behind manipulation, you stop fearing it. You start dismantling it. The exposure didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It unraveled, slowly, publicly, irreversibly. It started with a question. One simple question, posted in a family group, chat by someone who had always stayed neutral. Someone who had watched quietly and finally noticed the contradictions. Why does every version of this story paint the same woman as the villain, but none of the details match? Silence followed, then deflection, then anger, and then evidence. My son posted first, not emotionally, not defensively, just facts, screenshots, dates, messages that showed shifting explanations, emotional ultimatums, and threats masked as concern. He didn't name anyone directly. He didn't have to. The pattern spoke for itself. People began to read, to compare, to realize how carefully they had been guided toward one conclusion. Within hours, private messages poured in, apologies, regret, shock. I didn't know. I thought I was helping. She told us you were unstable. The lie had relied on isolation. Exposure destroyed it. Her response was immediate and furious. She called my son repeatedly. When he didn't answer, she sent messages, swinging wildly between pleading and rage. You're humiliating me. You're choosing her over us. After everything we did for you. Guilt, control, the same weapons now ineffective. Her mother followed, more calculated, more dangerous. She threatened legal action, reputation damage, social consequences, anything to regain control of the narrative. But narratives don't survive receipts. Someone shared a story anonymously online. No names, just experiences. Others responded. Similar patterns, similar language, similar outcomes. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was a pattern being recognized. By the next day, the wedding was officially canceled. Not postponed, canceled. The announcement was brief, neutral, carefully worded, but behind it was chaos. Accusations flying behind closed doors. Relationships fracturing under the weight of truth. Allies disappearing. My son sat beside me when he read the message confirming it. His hands trembled, not with fear this time, but with relief so sharp it almost hurt. I feel like I can breathe, he said. That was when I knew we had already won. But there was one final act left. Her last attempt came quietly. A letter, handwritten, slipped under my door. Inside, the tone was softer, regretful, controlled. It spoke of misunderstandings, of emotional reactions, of love. But buried in the words was the same message as always. If you stay silent now, we can all move on. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the folder with everything else. Silence was no longer an option. Not now, not ever again. My son looked at me later that night. Really looked at me, not as a problem, not as a past he needed to escape. As his mother. They almost made me hate you, he said. I nodded. That's how control works. They won't do that again, he said quietly. I believed him. Outside, the city lights glowed steadily, indifferent to the personal wars fought behind closed doors. But inside that small apartment, something sacred had been reclaimed. Truth, autonomy, and a bond that had survived attempted erasure. But healing, I knew, would be its own battle. Because even when manipulation is exposed, the damage it leaves behind doesn't disappear overnight. The days after the cancellation felt unreal. There was no dramatic explosion, no public apology, no sudden peace, just a strange stillness, like the air after a storm when everything looks the same but nothing feels unchanged. My son stayed with me. At first, he barely spoke. Trauma doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly in the body, waiting for permission to be felt. He flinched when his phone vibrated. He apologized for things that didn't need apologies. He asked for reassurance before making simple decisions. As if autonomy were a language he had forgotten how to speak. I watched him relearn himself. Slowly, painfully. One evening, while washing dishes side by side, he broke down without warning. His shoulders shook, his breath fractured, and he sank to the floor like his strength had finally given up holding everything together. I let them turn you into something ugly in my head, he said through tears. I doubted you, I doubted myself. I knelt beside him and held his face the way I used to when he was small. You survived, I said. That matters. But at your expense, he whispered. That was the hardest part for him to accept. That control never comes without collateral damage. He started therapy a week later. The first session left him exhausted. The second made him angry. By the third, he began to grieve, not just the relationship he lost, but the version of himself that had been slowly dismantled. Grief isn't just about losing people. It's about losing time. Months passed. The threats stopped. The messages disappeared. The burner accounts went quiet. Control had no oxygen without access. But consequences lingered. There were nights he woke up convinced he'd done something wrong. Days when guilt crept in uninvited, whispering that he had ruined everything. And moments, quiet, dangerous moments, when loneliness tried to rewrite the past as something tolerable. That's how manipulation survives, by romanticizing the pain. Each time we spoke, not as a mother and child clinging to each other in fear, but as two people choosing honesty over comfort. One afternoon, he took down the framed photo from his graduation and replaced it with a new one. The two of us sitting on a park bench. No forced smiles, just peace. I want to remember who I am now, he said. Years later, someone asked me if I regretted speaking up. I didn't hesitate. Regret comes from silence, not truth. My son rebuilt his life carefully. New friends, new boundaries. A relationship that moved slowly, respectfully, with no ultimatums hiding behind affection. He learned that love does not demand disappearance. On the anniversary of what would have been his wedding day, he brought me flowers. Thank you for not letting me vanish, he said. I looked at him, stronger, clearer, whole in a way I had feared was lost forever, and felt something settle in my chest at last. Love doesn't always look like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like refusal. Refusal to lie. Refusal to disappear. Refusal to let fear rewrite the truth. And in that refusal, something extraordinary happened. A mother kept her voice. A son reclaimed his life. And a story meant to erase us became the very thing that saved us.